Hi everybody, good afternoon. I'm Jeremy Wellard here, ICVA's Regional Representative for Asia. So welcome to ICVA's new learning stream webinars, Understanding the Role of Regional Humanitarian Actors. Very excited to be the first event in this series today here in Asia region and to be talking about the topic of understanding ASEAN, in particular the role of the AHA Centre. Now we've got a great panel of speakers to introduce today. Unfortunately, however, one of our guest speakers has been delayed in an urgent meeting, and so she's going to be joining us a little bit later. That's Miss Adelina Kamal, who's Executive Director of the AHA Centre. So she'll be coming online hopefully very shortly. In the meantime, though, however, I think best that we can proceed with the event as planned, and in particular, I'd like to introduce our other two panelists. Firstly, Dr. Heng Aik Cheng, who is Vice President of Mercy Malaysia and Chair of the ADMIR Partnership Group, and Mr. Oliver Lacy Hall, who is the Head of OCHA's Indonesia office and also the focal point for OCHA's engagement with ASEAN. So I think in order to get things started, we might reshuffle what our original plan was and just proceed with a slightly revised version, and then we'll ask Adelina to join in when she can get online. I can see in the chat box some good conversation with a few old colleagues, and it's great to have such a range of participants on the line from not just around Asia region, but also other parts of the world, and a big thanks to my colleagues in Geneva who are helping with the technology behind today's discussion. In true ASEAN style, in true Asian style, I think let's keep this as a conversation amongst friends. Please use the chat box as you are to ask questions and to share your comments. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability to connect everyone's audio in a way that makes for meaningful discussion, but we'll certainly endeavour to respond to any questions or comments that come up in the chat box. So the purpose of today's webinar really is to build on the work that we do here in the regional hub in Asia, and similarly to the work in the Middle East and in Africa regions that ICVA is doing, which is aimed at helping NGOs to better understand and connect with, wherever possible, the work of regional humanitarian actors. And so this webinar is really a chance for us to discuss the operations and the structure of the ASEAN Disaster Management Centre, or AHA Centre, its official title being ASEAN Coordinating Centre for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management. We'd like to learn more about the structure of the centre and also to talk about the ways different partners, including UN OCHA and NGOs, are engaging with the AHA Centre, understanding how this type of model helps different humanitarian actors to engage in the region, and perhaps what some of the implications for this might be in the future of ASEAN region, in the future of other regional organisations around the world. So rather than going to our initial introductory presentation by Adelina, which was to give the background to the role of the AHA Centre, I wonder if we could maybe start by reshuffling a bit and handing over to Dr. Heng from Mercy Malaysia to actually bring us in with an introduction of the ADMIR Partnership Group, which is a network of NGOs that has been working closely with ASEAN and the AHA Centre over many, many years. And I think if we begin with this, we can frame the discussion around the NGO engagement, and then we can add a bit more of the technical detail about the AHA Centre structure and function once Adelina joins the call in a few minutes. So to introduce Dr. Heng, Dr. Heng is a well-established expert in the region, both as an orthopaedic surgeon and in his spare time as Executive Committee member of Mercy Malaysia, where he's currently Vice President, and the Chair of the APG, or ADMIR Partnership Group. Dr. Heng's been involved in a number of regional organisations, including on a board level with the Asia Disaster Reduction and Response Network, or ADRRN. And he's been a first responder in emergency medical in many disasters across Asia and around the world through his work with Mercy Malaysia. So I think without further ado, maybe Dr. Heng, may I ask you to begin with a bit of a background on your work with ASEAN and with the AHA Centre, and introducing what the APG, or ADMIA Partnership Group, is and how it's helping NGOs to engage. Over to you. Thank you.
Hello everybody, and it's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you. Mercy Malaysia has been in existence since 1999, and we had been responding to natural disasters in Asia, and especially in Southeast Asia. So when the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, otherwise called ADMA, was first advocated and then signed, it was a great opportunity for all of us, actually, NGOs, INGOs, and government as well, and civil military, to be able to work together towards making natural disasters, towards making us more resilient to natural disasters. So we have got together, and all the NGOs, this was actually initially led by a few INGOs. They were SAVE, PLAN, Mercy Malaysia, Oxfam, and a few others. Anyway, 7 of us, and we got together and said, this is a great opportunity. Let's work together, and also let's engage the local NGOs. So we got together, and we also managed to talk to the representatives of different countries, and we got them to nominate their respective NGOs of the countries, so that we can all sit together and discuss the problems that we were having, and how also we could respond in case of natural disasters, and also what we could do to mitigate and prevent disasters happening. So after all these years, we are established, and we have worked very well together with the ASEAN Secretariat as well as the AHA Centre, and we look forward towards working together with INGOs as well, especially in the ASEAN region. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Heng, for that introduction. And just a little bit further update, because we've just received advice that AHA Centre are in some emergency meetings, so we are still trying to contact Adelina and find out her arrival time. However, we will persevere with the plan, and I'd now like to introduce Mr. Oliver Lacy Hall, who is head of OCHA's Indonesia office and Senior Liaison Officer for Engagement with ASEAN. And Oliver's been based in Jakarta for a number of years, and particularly focusing on supporting and strengthening OCHA's relationship with the ASEAN member states and the ASEAN portfolio. Prior to this, Oliver was Regional Director for OCHA's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, and he's had a long history, too long to go into actually, in the humanitarian sector, focusing on numerous issues, both in Asia and other parts of the world. So, Oliver, please, over to you to share more about OCHA's engagement with the AHA Centre. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, and yes, you're quite right, it is too long. It even frightens me now. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of 2 things, I guess. One is kind of the changing regional dynamics around preparedness and response in the region, and for those of you who's heard this before from me, I'm sorry You're going to hear it again. And then a little bit about how we've gone about engaging with ASEAN and specifically with the AHA Centre over the last few years. And I don't know if you're looking at your computers, but I have a little slideshow. So maybe just to kick off with some thoughts about sort of the changing dynamics in this region. And for old timers like Steve Munsey and myself who've been around in Asia for a long time working on humanitarian issues, there are some quite big changes which have taken a very large number of years to come to fruition, but we're kind of there now. You know, the region is largely composed of either middle or upper income countries, and that's had huge implications for how things are resourced, how humanitarian and development organizations from from the global level are interacting with countries across the region. It's also meant there's been a very big change in the way in which governments in the region lead on humanitarian affairs, on disaster response, and so on and so forth. And I think that the Hyogo Framework for Action and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, both of which really have most of their language, which was bashed out in the regional meetings that took place in this part of the world, have really acted to drive a lot of the thinking and action around humanitarian, around disaster management in this region. We see an increasing number of sort of robust legal frameworks for disaster management. There's a picture up here of the Indonesian law 24 of 2007 on disaster management. By no means a perfect law, but Indonesia knows that, and they're working to amend and update it. And pretty much every country across the region now has some kind of legislation on how it manages disasters in the region. We've seen this kind of decrease in the likelihood of countries across the region to accept assistance from outside, to accept international assistance. We have seen a change in the way in which assistance is accepted rather than being requested. This is a change in semantics, but it also has significance in the way in which governments perceive and understand their engagement with outside actors. We see, and we're talking today about this increasing involvement of regional organizations. We have ASEAN here, we have the African Union in Africa, SARC not so much perhaps in South Asia, but there are other things going on there which are of interest, but an increasing engagement of regional organizations. And so a kind of change in the role of international organizations like the United Nations, big international NGOs, which is really to kind of augment and support national and regional capacity rather than kind of get in and do the work ourselves, except when there are really enormous disasters. And then at that time, governments say, yeah, we appreciate you coming to help, but what we want is speed, what we want is volume of assistance, and we want it done efficiently and with full respect for the way in which we do business in our countries. So those are kind of some of the dynamics. So, 3 or 4 emerging principles that we're kind of observing, certainly from the UN side. One, this national capacity and leadership where governments lead response to crises. Secondly, this increasing move towards localization of humanitarian response. It's local, it's national, it's regional, and the pressure certainly came from the World Humanitarian Summit for that to be emphasized and to really push that forward on disaster management. Whether the same applies for crisis response, for conflict response is perhaps something that is being oversimplified and that we need to do some more thinking around. But certainly the international organization's role is shifting from this kind of responder and provider of direct assistance to really kind of last resort, pass through, technical advisors and so on and so forth for disaster management, but interestingly not actually for not for conflict, where the international system is still very much engaged in providing humanitarian assistance, in ensuring the observance of humanitarian principles, and so on and so forth. So this final point is really what governments are looking for, and what people who are affected by disasters are looking for is speed, volume, quality from the international system. So that's a little bit about kind of the changing regional dynamics, if you like. In our cooperation with ASEAN, with the UN's cooperation with ASEAN, it's kind of like Dr. Heng said, we've been at this for a while, really kicking off just at the turn of the century on disaster management, as ASEAN started to think a little bit about sort of the dynamics around managing disasters in the region. And of course, the articulation of the ADME, the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, was really the starting off point for that. And my organization, OCHA, was engaged with ASEAN, supporting ASEAN in advising on some of the language that should go into that document. And then a whole kind of slew of things have happened since then. We had the ratification of the ADMIR in 2009. We had a declaration in 2010 between ASEAN and the UN on disaster management, which kind of laid out a framework for how we would work and plan together. The UN and ASEAN agreed a comprehensive partnership covering all the pillars of engagement between ASEAN and the UN in 2011. And the 2010 Hanoi Declaration said we need a plan for how we're going to work together. Please elaborate a plan. And so this ASEAN-UN Joint Strategic Plan on Disaster Management has really been the touchstone of how we have operationally planned and to a certain extent strategically planned and worked together. That's now in its third iteration. There was one for 2011 to 2013, 2014 to 2015, and now 2016 to 2020. And each time we produce it, it gets a little bit better. And then, of course, there are ASEAN documents which help to guide us. Some very clear planning documentation from the ADMIR work program, which I think everyone is familiar with. The ASEAN 2025 vision, forging ahead together, this kind of broad ASEAN vision, and then the specific vision on disaster management, which really lays out where ASEAN would like to be 8 years from now. On our side, of course, we have well, not on our side, but on the international global side, we have the Sustainable Development Agenda, which very much, the ASEAN 2025 vision and the Sustainable Development Agenda are very much symbiotic documents. We have the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction also taking us through to 2030. And specifically on the humanitarian side, we had the outcomes of the World Humanitarian Summit in May last year. And we have a sort of also a broader ASEAN-UN Plan of Action 2016 to 2020, under which this the Joint Strategic Plan on Disaster Management sits. That Joint Strategic Plan on Disaster Management has really kind of laid out how we work together, and it's a negotiated document from both sides. You know, we both had to give a bit, we both took a bit in terms of trying to make sure that we had a really clear and principled way of working with each other. So, you know, the agreement is that the decisions are taken jointly. We have the ACDM on the ASEAN side. We have the technical working group for the regional coordination mechanism of the UN, which is managed out of Bangkok. We've agreed that everything that we do will be consistent with the 8 priority programs included in ASEAN's 2016 to 2020 work program, and sort of 4 typologies of engagement or support, mutual support either way. 1, UN direct support to the achievement of ASEAN's objectives. Secondly, areas where ASEAN and the UN recognize the need to align initiatives and make sure that we are working symbiotically. Thirdly is areas where ASEAN needs to be introduced to international commitments and priorities, which we feel that should be included in the ADMIR work program. So more for sort of discussion than just automatic inclusion. And finally, advocacy for ASEAN engagement on initiatives and specific regional priorities that are supported by and implemented by the UN that are in line with ASEAN's priorities. And the operational level work is discussed through each of the ACDM working groups, of which there are 5, but 8 of those 8 priority programs fit into one of those 5 ACDM working groups. So we have, a clear set of principles which we hammered out in a series of discussions in 2015, 2016, and we have a very clear way of working together operationally. When it comes to the actual kind of the last thing a government needs pitching up on its shores in the event of a large-scale disaster is 2 separate coordinating entities saying we're here to help you. ASEAN arriving at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and saying we're here to help you, and OCHA rolling up an hour later and saying we're here to help you too. And those 2 not actually talking to or coordinating with one with the other. So we've done a lot of work trying to identify, what does that interoperability between the 2 organizations look like? And this kind of just gives you an idea of, how we have tried to break that down. We recognize the 2 organizations, we recognize the governance structures through the GA resolutions on our side, through the ADMIR on the ASEAN side. We know that there needs to be a relationship between the Emergency Relief Coordinator and the ASEAN Secretary General, who puts on this Humanitarian Assistance Coordinator hat for ASEAN in the event of a large-scale disaster in the region. We know that there needs to be a strong symbiotic and interoperable relationship between OCHA and the AHA Center as the 2 coordinating entities. We both have ways of working with our respective clients, if you like, on our side, UN agencies, organizations that come under the Interagency Standing Committee, and working in high-risk countries on emergency response preparedness. ASEAN is elaborating this joint disaster response plan, and we've agreed that to the extent possible, those two plans will be symbiotic and that they talk to each other. We have on our side the UN Disaster Assessment and Coordination Team. We have the Emergency Rapid Assessment Team on the ASEAN side. We have our on-site Operations Coordination Centre. ASEAN has the Joint Operations Coordination Centre for ASEAN. And we have various pieces of guidance around civil-military coordination, and ASEAN has SASOC Chapter 6 to address that. So we have to find a way to make all of these work, and that really is the focus of a lot of the engagement that we've had over the last 2 or 3 years, and a lot of the stuff that's included in this Joint Strategic Plan on Disaster Management, which is not only between OCHA and ASEAN, but between 14 UN agencies and ASEAN, with OCHA as kind of the bag carrier or the organizer on the UN side to bring those 14 agencies together. So that's where the interoperability piece is. It looks like this in terms of we've started to kind of figure this out to really look at it in some detail. This is how we see the relationship between the On-Site Operations Coordination Centre, the Joint Operations Coordination Centre. People ask questions quite often, why do you have two? Well, we have two because we actually have separate constituencies. The relationship between the AHA Centre and the ASEAN member states is governed by the ADMIR. We work under the aegis of the Interagency Standing Committee with the clients that we have there, international non-governmental organizations, UN agencies. The Red Cross family has an engagement with the IASC, and so on and so forth. So we have different constituencies. What we've tried to do here is ensure that our planning, our situation analysis, and so on and so forth is absolutely joined up. So these two yellow boxes that you see are actually kind of one joint situation and planning cell. We have a joint reception and departure center for everybody coming into and out of the country. And for the rest of it, we talk to each other, we work together, we meet with government together. But we recognize that we're kind of dealing with these two separate sets of stakeholders. If I just go back, each of these levels, for the Emergency Relief Coordinator and the ASEAN Humanitarian Assistance Coordinator, we concluded in August this year a kind of 5-page document that says, in the event of a large-scale disaster, this is what these two are going to do about, in terms of picking up the phone and talking to each other, possibly deploying jointly if there's a high-level visit, helping with resource mobilization on both sides, so on and so forth. And this is what we expect our respective organizations to be doing together outside times of disasters. And that's very much, building trust, cooperation, and so on and so forth. And that spills over, of course, into the way in which the AHA Centre and my organization, OCHA, work together. It comes down into how we are doing our joint preparedness planning with governments. In this region, there are 3 priority countries: Indonesia, the Philippines, and Myanmar. And in each of those countries, we are working symbiotically to ensure that our response planning is completely and totally joined up and supportive of government efforts. For UNDAC AIRAT, I'm not sure of the percentages, but a large number of AIRAT team members are also trained members of UNDAC, with the principle that, if we need people to join UNDAC teams outside the ASEAN region, they go with an UNDAC hat on, whereas inside the region they'll probably deploy as AIRAT. The JOCA and OSOC I've already talked about. That's kind of what I wanted to explain a bit today. It's been a really interesting journey. It's been bumpy at certain points. There's been suspicion. There have been difficulties. But I think, over the last few years, we've got beyond our kind of teenage angst, and we're now young adults and working nicely together in the pursuit of common goals and so on and so forth. So it's going fairly well now. I enjoy certainly interacting fairly regularly with my ASEAN and AHA Centre colleagues here in Jakarta. So that's about what I have for you now, but I'm happy to take any questions, and I see some popping up on the right-hand side. So thank you.
Thanks, Oliver. A very comprehensive and concise summary of what has obviously been a lot of work over many years. And I like your comment that that everyone in this discussion are young adults. So I think we keep the enthusiasm of youth in and the optimism of youth in some of our questions. I'm just going to actually pick up on two of these questions now, particularly of interest. Firstly, I think back to Dr. Heng for a follow-up question on the initial arrangements between NGOs and ASEAN that led to the formation of the ADMIR Partnership Group. Why was it that a group of NGOs got together and started to do this, rather than continuing to engage more directly through individual governments or member states of ASEAN at the time? What was the situation or the rationale behind the initial decision to engage with ASEAN collectively as a group of NGOs? Over to you, Dr. Heng.
I think at that time, we suddenly realized that we couldn't work on our own anymore. And to be really effective, we needed to work together with the whole ASEAN government. It was the region that was important. And for us to continue working in our own silos in different countries, it just wasn't practical anymore. On top of that, the idea was to empower as many local NGOs as possible. It was a big dream that eventually the local NGOs would be good enough, strong enough to be able to take over our positions. I think this is something that we saw sort of 10 years ago, noting the economic development of ASEAN and also the great interest among the NGOs. But let's not forget, NGOs have been in existence in ASEAN countries and Asian countries for centuries. They have been busy doing their own thing, but it doesn't mean that they are not doing any recognized humanitarian work. And the idea is actually to get them, and all of us, to work together towards a single goal with the same idea. Thank you.
Thank you. And then a follow-on question, Dr. Heng. With this agreement to engage with ASEAN more strategically, how has that helped NGOs such as Mercy Malaysia, being a ASEAN-born NGO and then starting to operate more at a regional level? And I know we have Stephen from CFSI in the Philippines doing similar work here, and others on the call. What's the kind of the support that has been able to come from an individual NGO perspective through having a more structured engagement with ASEAN overall? Over.
I think when it first started 10 years ago, there were very, very few ASEAN-born NGOs that did any work outside their own country. But now, after 10 years of development, we are seeing a lot more ASEAN-born NGOs actually working in countries other than their own. Working with ASEAN is actually very, very helpful because we can actually attend the ACDM meetings and present plans and ideas that can be adopted for the whole ASEAN region. We can present ideas on emergency response, and recently one of our big ideas was the ASEAN Safe School Initiative, which was presented to the ACDMs and which has been adopted, and it's actually being in the process of being implemented in the ASEAN region. The other one that has just come about is an idea that has been promoted by Mercy Malaysia called Building Resilient Communities. And this was presented at an ACDM. Again, the 10 countries discuss about it, and probably we hope that they will adopt these ideas So yes, now when NGOs talk, the 10 ASEAN countries listen to them and actually give weight to whatever is being discussed by NGOs. Thank you.
Oliver, a couple of questions around the relationship between ASEAN and OCHA, and I guess more technically on the monitoring of the strategic plan of action over its work period. How is that being undertaken? Is that being undertaken, and is there a platform in place to do it? And I guess also as a more broad question, what does OCHA get out of this relationship? Why does OCHA choose to invest what is obviously so much effort in engaging with the AHA Centre? Is there a bigger picture in mind from OCHA's side? Over to you.
Oh, hang on. No, I'm not on mute. Can you hear me? Hello?
Ken, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, all right, fine. Sorry, I wasn't sure where it was off or on. Okay. On the monitoring of the strategic plan, yes, there is a formal process. We sit down once a year and look at where we are on the plan. We do that through the process is that we report back to each of the working groups meet. Sorry, let me start again. The 5 working groups under ADMIR meet twice a year. One of those sessions is an open session, usually the one that takes place in the autumn, so around about now. And for that meeting, we prepare an update on where we are against the implementation of the UN inputs against each of the strategic, the 8 priority programs. That's presented to the ACDM the relevant working group. We discuss it, some adjustments are undertaken, sometimes some revision is made, and then the whole thing is put together and sent to the October meeting of the ASEAN Committee on Disaster Management, which is taking place this year in Vientiane, I think the week after next. And they basically take a look at it and say, this looks, it looks like we're making progress. So that's how we are monitoring against the Joint Strategic Plan of Action. So there is in fact a process in place. Why is OCHA doing this? Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that, there are 2 or 3 reasons. We have a number of extremely significant crises going on in other parts of the world. Syria, Somalia, you name it. I think everybody is aware. And here we have a part of the world which is saying, let us get on with this. Let us do this. But for the time being, hold our hand as we do it. So that's kind of where I think we're at, and we find that the grip on that hand holding is becoming ever looser as ASEAN, it becomes increasingly confident about its capacity to respond to disasters in the region. I would say, that it hasn't really been tested by a hyper large disaster since the AHA Centre was set up. There was the engagement in Typhoon Haiyan. But that was very soon after the centre was set up, and I think the lesson that they learned out of that was that there needs to be a great deal more sort of political and financial will on the part of the member states to respond to those sorts of disasters from within the region. But still, there was a large international presence that came in. But I think the aim of any good humanitarian should be to work ourselves out of a job. Now, I don't think we can say that in Asia you can work yourselves out of a job when it comes to disaster response, disaster preparedness, disaster risk reduction, because it's the most disaster-prone region of the world, and that's not going to change. But how those disasters are managed, as I tried to explain at the beginning, is really important. This decreasing role for the international system. I would see 10, 15 years from now that when we're talking about natural disasters, there won't be a role for organizations like OCHA and the World Food Programme and so on and so forth. These, the kinds of goods and services that we provide will come from inside the region. They will come either from ASEAN or from, very strong national NGOs or regional non-governmental organizations from this region, or, as we see happening with, say, the Children's Fund and other organizations here in Indonesia, sort of local chapters of international non-governmental organizations. But the requirement for a kind of large international contingent, I think, will be gone. And I, for my part and for the part of OCHA, that's what we're driving towards. The day when we can say, when it comes to disaster management, we recognize that the region can manage fairly well by itself. As I said in my introductory remarks, I don't think the same applies yet, and I'm not sure it will ever apply for situations of conflict. And that is simply because the mandate that ASEAN has on that and the way in which the agreement between the 10 member states is constructed makes it very difficult for the kind of challenge that the UN and non-governmental organizations can provide to governments in conflict situations simply isn't going to come from within ASEAN. So we have to, I think, be mindful of the fact that, when we talk about scaling back, that doesn't mean a complete departure, because there are going to be activities in areas where my sense is that the international humanitarian system will need to remain engaged in this region for some time to come. And we only need to look at what's happening between Myanmar and Bangladesh right now, I think, to understand the dynamics around that. So I think that's one. I think, secondly, if you look at the Charter of the United Nations, it talks about regional organizations going first. The UN is supposed to be kind of, the last resort. Regional organizations are supposed to get in there and work on peace and security issues, are supposed to work on disaster risk management issues and so on and so forth. And we want to encourage that to happen. So it's those, I think, are sort of the two big ones. And the third one, from my own personal perspective, is it's something that I believe in. I believe that the region should be taking care of, paying the bills for its disaster risk reduction, its disaster response. So anything I can do to help accelerate that process happening, I will do. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Oliver. Very, very clear and very compelling arguments there, and I think speaks a lot to why you're based in Jakarta in that role at the moment. A couple of really interesting questions here regarding engagement of personnel from NGOs in the AHA Centre's mechanisms around, is there any training, or has there been training for personnel from NGOs and CSOs? Is there any roster existing or planned about combining resources between OCHA, the AHA Centre, and is there a possibility for CSOs, NGOs to get engaged, and if so, how? So I might open that to either or both of you for comments. Maybe Dr. Heng first, if you would like to, and then Oliver, if you have any thoughts to follow.
Thank you. The AHA Centre has actually invited CSOs to send their representatives to be trained in Iraq. I think it started about last year, and there have been a few members from the CSOs who have been trained. But I think one of the problems that we face, and I'm speaking from Mercy Malaysia's point of view, when a big disaster happens, we need all our personnel to be responding, and we really don't have the luxury of sending somebody to Iraq to help. But what we have done is recently we have actually opened this to all our volunteers. I mean, we have about 4,000 of our volunteers, and to choose which ones are interested to help out in Iraq. That's all. And a lot of the other local NGOs too would be suffering from this same problem. Of course, INGOs perhaps have more resources than we have, and perhaps they can send some of their members to be trained. But as far as the AHA Centre is concerned, yes, they have opened it to all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Heng. I've also also just been chatting with Vanda from Plan International, who's the co-chair of the APG and is involved in some roster work at the regional level. And I've just invited her to add a few comments to this. Vanda, if you can unmute yourself, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Jeremy. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you.
Okay, super. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Just to add what Dr. Heng already mentioned, because basically we are from the same, the group, the Admin Partnership group. Just to add, basically in the era, from what my understanding, that they are currently they are open also for Red Cross. They invited Red Cross to be part of that roster. And for APG, we already been involved in the ERAT. We are sending at least in the last 4 batch of the ERAT training, and we also already have experience that 1 or 2 of our colleagues already been deployed, at least one in high-end response, as Olivia mentioned, just right after they set up AHA Center, as well as during the flood response in Myanmar. So one is basically Oxfam colleague, and then the second one in Myanmar is from Plan colleague who part of the ERAT. I think as of now, I mean, they are also preparing their, I think the 13th batch in November, and they already indicated they also will invite APG member to sending a participant for it. So that's basically in terms of ERAT relate with the APG. On the other hand, I would just like to answer as what Jeremy asked. So currently, there is also another roster that basically happening at the regional level, especially in Asia, under the SART network from the Transforming Search Capacity, what we basically call Go Team Asia. And we basically, this is a platform member as well from 7 NGO that working at the regional level that linking with the START network. So this Go Team Asia is already exists, and as of now is we are not only targeting the country within the ASEAN region, but also beyond ASEAN, which is like Bangladesh, like Sri Lanka and other country. Currently, there is an interesting learning for this Go Team Asia and this platform, because like everybody aware about what happened in Bangladesh now with the Rohingya response. So soon we are going to send one of our colleagues to support the NGO coordination in this Rohingya response from this network. And we are also in touch with AHA Center to see to what extent that we are able to linking both of the roster to making sure that we can at least not sending to ERAT, but to what extent that if there's any combination, the best combination for the response, especially when something huge happen at the ASEAN member state. This is still under discussion, but both AHA Center as well as Go Team Asia, we already aware each other, and also the other roster member that basically set up at the regional level by other organization, like for example, like our colleague from Oxfam, they have their roster, World Vision, and this is something that we continue engage with AHA Center to making sure if something happen in ASEAN member state, at least there will be a setup of mechanism and coordination clearly to avoid any overlap and duplication. I will stop there, Jeremy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Vanda. Thank you. Oliver, did you want to add anything in terms of OCHA's perspective on regional rosters or capacity to deploy in the region?
ERAT team and ASEAN ERAT is, as you know, kind of ASEAN's primary response capacity mechanism right now. We try and make sure that most of the ERAT team members are members of the UNDAC team, and there's now a discussion about making sure that Asian members of UNDAC team or ASEAN member state members of the UNDAC team who are not yet members of the ERAT team should become members of the ERAT team. That would seem to make sense, that we have that sort of full interoperability there. Beyond that, I mean, this region needs, I think, to have its own regional response rosters. You have, of course, the REDAR roster operating out of Australia, which can, I think, be replicated probably across the region. There are REDARs being set up in various countries within ASEAN, and it would be good, I think, to start to think about lobbying some of the governments in this region to start picking up the bills for things like running emergency response rosters. because I think it's time that that happens. And if we want to be really realistic about the capacity of the region to respond to a large-scale disaster, sort of more independently of the UN and the international non-governmental organizations coming in, and looking at kind of regional response rosters, I think would be useful. And it's also useful from the perspective of making sure that there's a sufficiently large trained cadre of disaster response officers, managers, staff here within the region. We still struggle a little bit with particular areas of specialist expertise for UNDAC. So a real focus on capacity support to people who can travel from one country to another and set up very quickly in the event there is a large-scale disaster. That would be an area for me that if I was the AHA Centre I would be focusing on, and pulling on capacities that already exist and saying how can we use those capacities to support us here in this region. I'm thinking particularly of as I said, Red R Australia, but also the Red R chapters that are being set up in I know for certainly in Indonesia, and I think also in one or two other countries.
Great, thank you. And I think very interesting to reflect on a point Dr. Heng raised before, which is about the capacity of NGOs participating in rosters to actually surrender key staff in a time of an emergency. I think it's a discussion that could benefit from strategic involvement and support from ASEAN member states to actually enable that capacity, that additional capacity to be built in order to be able to deploy. Now, another hot topic question, Dr. Heng, perhaps Vanda as well, membership of the APG. Would it be helpful? Would it be problematic to grow? I know there are some plans underway to broaden membership. How might this go ahead? What would be required from NGOs for membership, for particularly other NGOs that are emerging out of the ASEAN region? Over.
Approached, in fact, this has been done before. We have approached the 10 ASEAN governments and asked them to nominate an NGO within their country to be an associate member of APG. And the idea is actually to get them involved in it and to empower them so that eventually they will be strong enough to take over the role of our role, which is the INGO's roles. It's a long journey. As we can see in ASEAN, the development of the 10 countries are not exactly the same. And what we have also done then is we have sort of have a program to mentor certain NGOs in some countries which may not be so developed, and eventually try as much as possible to bring them into APG. We have no problems actually opening it up, but I think we have to be very careful that it doesn't get overwhelmed by too many people. At the moment, we don't see a problem there because all the members actually have to pay for their own traveling expenses and have to pay for their own meetings and lodgings. So unless certain NGOs then have that sort of capacity, it's not going to be easy, and I can't see the organization being overwhelmed by too many NGOs. Okay.
Great, thanks, Dr. Heng. Now, a couple of our participants are on the line from outside the ASEAN region, and there's been a few questions related to a question that I actually wanted to ask, which again goes to both of our presenters. Outside of the ASEAN region, how do these models find application? What processes might be underway to look at a similar type of agreement in the South Asia region with SAARC, for example, or even on another continent? Are you aware of any processes that are being implemented that could be supported, or that could be actually avenues for participants from outside of ASEAN region to actually get involved in? Over.
Shall I go first?
Please, go ahead, Oliver.
So I have two thoughts on this. I mean, there was the specific question from Alan, I think, was around SAARC. SAARC has a legally binding agreement between the member states of SAARC on how they will work together in the event of a large-scale emergency in the SAARC region. There is as I understand, a disaster management centre, a SAARC disaster management centre, and there has been for some time. SAARC has been to visit the AHA Centre to understand how ASEAN has set itself up. The problem in the SAARC region, as I understand it, and as was explained to me by a number of diplomats from the region, is that whilst the mechanisms are all there, the political will to make all of this work is not. And for the time being, with the political dynamics that exist between two of the larger SAARC member states, it's highly unlikely that things will move in the same direction as they've been able to move in ASEAN, which is unfortunate, but unfortunately a political fact of life. So, we've made representations, we as ARCHA have made representations to the SAARC Secretariat. There is a draft MOU, which was drafted in 2012, I think, by us, and presented to the SAARC Secretariat, and there it has sat. Since then, we have, on a number of occasions, tried to move that process forward and been rebuffed on each occasion because the member states cannot agree on whether they wish to have an MOU with OCHA to start looking at the kinds of things that we have been looking at with ASEAN for the last 10 years without, I would hasten to say, an MOU with ASEAN. So SAARC, I think, has its own particularities. What I think was interesting coming again out of the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016 was this Regional Humanitarian Organizations Humanitarian Action Network, or ROHAN, which was basically something that the Overseas Development Institute had kind of been facilitating for a couple of years before that, getting regional organizations around a table to look at how they were each approaching humanitarian issues, disaster management, to see if there were synergies and ways in which they could kind of come together. The big takeaway is that if you look at sort of the international legislation, General Assembly resolutions and so on and so forth, there's nothing in them about regional organizations and the role that regional organizations should be playing or could be playing in disaster management, in humanitarian affairs, in emergency response, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that Regional Organizations Humanitarian Action Network is slowly looking at is, where are we? How are we represented? What voice do we have on the international stage, and how might that work? Now that's an extremely complicated proposition because, one of the things that I've learned and noticed through working with my colleagues at ASEAN is that we at the UN have an easier time of it with our member states than, with our 191 member states, than ASEAN does with its 10 member states. In terms of agreeing things, because we were set up in a different era, we have different governance mechanisms, and the oversight of the United Nations is actually not as what's the word I'm looking for? As detailed as it is for an organisation like ASEAN. It's the same for the AU and for the League of Arab States and all of the other big regional and sub-regional organisations. So, sorry, a very kind of long-winded way of saying things are happening. They're not necessarily being facilitated by the United Nations, but the United Nations is keeping an eye on what is happening and seeing if we can take some of the lessons that we've learned here in the ASEAN region and apply them elsewhere. I think ASEAN is keen to do the same. So we're certainly talking to them about the possibilities of doing that. But it's a long, slow road, and I think needs to be underwritten by a kind of some kind of nod and wink by the General Assembly that this is where they would like to go. And then, of course, the same nod and wink through the regional mechanism. So things are moving, but I couldn't sort of concretely put my finger on an example of where things have actually moved beyond the formation of the Regional Organizations Humanitarian Action Network. It met last year in Jakarta, here in Jakarta, and will meet again in Addis Ababa next month for its second meeting to again flesh out what it might be able to do. Back to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you. Dr. Heng, from your perspective with the APG or with Mercy Malaysia even responding outside the region, has there been any opportunity to build on the relationship with ASEAN when working in other regional contexts, or to use the conversations that have been had to better understand the dynamics in other regions? Over.
I think the thing that works in ASEAN is the politics. The politics in ASEAN there's a lot more understanding. And as a result of that, working in that region and getting a program like ADMA and for NGOs to work in different countries is a lot easier. As for working outside, Mercy Malaysia actually responds to disasters outside. We are in Bangladesh, we've been in the Middle East and all that. And we have been now discussing with ASEAN that if they wish to have one region, one response, the AHA Centre is more than welcome to work with Mercy Malaysia whenever we are outside the ASEAN region. And also, this is also extended to all the other ASEAN NGOs, that when we are over there, we can certainly help you with our connections in these different countries to find you a place that you would wish to work in. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Heng. So we have one last question on the board. If anyone else wants to add any further questions, please do. We're just actually trying to get Adelina on the phone now. We've got in touch and working through some technical difficulties, so I'm hoping she will join us any moment. In terms of approaches for capacity building at the regional level, and certainly I think ICVA in our own small way through this type of discussion are trying to help NGOs better understand what's taking place within the humanitarian space at the regional level. But are there any other programs? Is there any plan for the ADMA Partnership Group or any other partners that you're aware of to start to more strategically build the capacity of NGOs to engage? And I particularly refer, Dr. Heng, to maybe a follow-up comment on your previous introduction of the idea of building capacity of national NGOs. You know, how might that be taken forward more strategically, and what could other NGOs do to actually take part in that process?
Also from the private sector, go through. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, you were on mute.
Hello?
Could you please? Yeah, could you just start again? You were on mute at the start, please.
Okay, I'm all right now. Good. The APG had a program over a year with 4 different meetings lasting over about a week, actually, where we had members from NGOs, from the private sector, from the public sector, go through a course. And then during that period, it's a leadership course, in which during that period they interacted together and also got to know each other very well. So we were actually very happy, because at the end of that 1 year, all these people were interacting together, and it was a great opportunity, because then we had people. And there was this core group of people from NGOs and from all these other different sectors who could work together, who knew each other, a great networking, and If anything happened, it was about relationship. They could call somebody in government or they could call somebody in private, and they could actually get things through a lot faster. I think we have to understand in ASEAN a lot of work and speed is actually due to relationships and how well you know and trust that you have built over the years. So this is a program that actually we would like to continue over the next few years, so that eventually we will have a group of people who are well connected right at the top and know each other very well and trust each other, and so that whenever a disaster happens, they can actually act very, very quickly and implement programs very, very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Heng. And very happy to say that that Adelina Kamal, Executive Director of AHA Centre, has been able to join us by phone. So we're going to connect now, if possible, via Geneva back to Jakarta in a truly global teleconferencing process, and welcome Adelina to the call. Adelina, can you hear me?
Uh-huh. Can you hear? No.
Sorry,
Oh, hold on. Hold on. Hold on. We're trying to. I don't think people can hear. We're trying to see if we can increase the volume. Speakerphone. Speakerphone. Yeah. Hello. Can you hear us?
Hello?
Any better?
Hello? Can I speak now?
Yes. You can try now.
Okay. Yeah. Again, good afternoon, everyone. Jeremy, thank you very much. An apology that I can only join the webinar now. I got trapped in a traffic jam due to the heavy rain. And I was actually on my way back to the office. I will now follow your cue, Jeremy, whether I can start with the presentation or we are now in the question and answer session.
Yeah, thanks, Adelina. We actually
Hello?
improvised and we did, yes,
Yes, go on.
It would be fantastic to give us a brief overview of the AHA Centre from your perspective. Thank you.
Hello?
Dr. Kamal, you can go ahead with an overview of the AHA Centre from your perspective there.
Okay. Thank you. I have actually sent the presentation material earlier, but I will provide the background briefly, and for further details, then the colleagues from ICVA could refer to the presentation material that I've distributed earlier. First of all, AHA Centre is a regional organization. It's an ASEAN body established in November 2011. So we are almost 6 years old. We're a very young organization. We're established by the ASEAN member states through 2 legally binding agreements. The first one is the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, which provides the legal framework for ASEAN countries to work together in reducing losses as well as collectively responding to disasters in the region. This first agreement was signed after the Indian Ocean tsunami, and it provides for the establishment of our center. The second legally binding agreement that provides for the establishment of our center is the agreement on the establishment of our center, and this is the basically the legal birth certificate of our center. It got signed November 2011, so about almost 6 years ago. Based on the mandate given by this agreement, our center is tasked to facilitate cooperation and coordination among the ASEAN countries in coordination with the United Nations and other international organizations. We, in the past 5 years, we have responded to 17 disaster emergencies. We have put in place disaster monitoring and preparedness and response tools. They can be activated anytime. We have, for example, the ASEAN Emergency Response and Assessment Team that have been deployed 20 times to 7 ASEAN countries. We have the emergency stockpile in Subang, Malaysia, basically consisting of non-food items, and this is readily deployable items that can be mobilized to affected countries in the ASEAN region, and we're establishing two more warehouses in other countries, namely Philippines and Thailand. We also have conducted a number of capacity building program, basically trying to realize the vision of ASEAN to become the future global leaders, the future global leader on disaster management, in view of the experience that has been accumulated by the ASEAN countries over the past decade. Our center consists of about 31 staff members. We report directly to the 10 ASEAN countries through the National Disaster Management Organizations, or the NGOs. In fact, next week we will be having a governing board meeting where we will discuss the progress of our center as well as other matters that require consideration of the governing board. We're working very closely with our partners as well as other sectors and stakeholders. Last year, there's a watershed movement made by our leaders where they issued the ASEAN declaration on One ASEAN, One Response, ASEAN responding together as one to disasters inside and outside the region. And because of this declaration, we need to work with the different sectors in ASEAN, so not only mobilizing resources from the disaster management sector, but also other sectors like the health, social welfare, the defense and military sector, and stakeholders including the United Nations, the Red Cross, the civil society partners, and the private sector. That's basically essentially the vision of One ASEAN, One Response, identifying capabilities inside the region from different sectors and stakeholders to respond to be able to respond to the large-scale disasters by identifying the needs and the gaps of the affected country and see how resources within the region can complement the resources of the affected countries. Within the One ASEAN, One Response vision, we also are putting in place mechanisms where we will work together with the so-called plus countries of ASEAN, and this include China, Japan, Korea, Australia, United States, India, Russia, and New Zealand, and other mechanisms related to ASEAN to basically help mobilize resources in terms of large-scale natural disasters. And in the future, we have set the motion to also prepare our staff to be able to respond to disasters outside the region. And this is part of returning the favor, because many of the countries in ASEAN have been the recipients of international assistance, but right now many of us are moving towards becoming countries that also provide assistance to those in need. I will stop at that, and we'll take questions, and we can have further discussions on the background of our center. Over to you, Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adelina, and really appreciate you battling the weather to join us. First question from myself, just following on some of the discussion we were having before you joined, which was around the NGO engagement with the AHA Centre and ASEAN. From your perspective, what is the value of the engagement with the APG ADMIR Partnership Group? How can it continue to add value to the AHA Centre's work? And are there any plans in future to extend or expand this operation from the perspective of the AHA Centre? Over.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Well, as I've mentioned earlier, under the One ASEAN One Response, we're talking not only about having the government responding to disaster, we're also inviting other elements of the society. So therefore, when we are putting in place the mechanisms such as the ERAT, the Emergency Response and Assessment Team, our regional contingency plan, we also include the elements of civil society. Now, we started this motion after Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar in 2008. I was quite heavily involved in ASEAN response to Cyclone Nargis, and that was also the first time that we worked on the ground together with the other humanitarian actors, including the United Nations and the civil society. So we had a very good experience working with the civil society out of Cyclone Nargis, and because of that experience, then ASEAN decided to institutionalize this and invited civil society to basically contribute to the implementation of the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response. So I recall that Cyclone Nargis was in 2008, and in 2009, as we at that time in 2009, the agreement on disaster management and emergency response was about to enter into force. All the 10 countries at that time already ratified the agreement. So we had a visioning exercise in Indonesia on how we can implement the agreement. And based on the experience of Cyclone Nargis in 2008, then we invited, among others, not only the relevant government units in ASEAN, but also our partners, including the civil society. And we were glad with the response from, the civil society. Many of them who came to the vision exercise were partners with us from Cyclone Nargis response. And they also met with the Secretary General of ASEAN at that time, also the ASEAN Secretariat. And after that, then the APG was born. The APG was not created by ASEAN. It was not created by the ASEAN Secretariat. It was not created by ASEAN. It was actually created by the civil society themselves, who got together and decided that they have the implementation of the work of the patient. And when also I will invite any activities of the center, like for example, for ASEAN ERAT, right now we have close to 200 ERA-trained members, and some of them actually come from the civil society. We invited APG to send people to also participate in our ERA. So and they have been actually deployed together with us in many occasions. They have also been invited to contribute to many of our capacity building programs where invited NGOs of the ASEAN countries, and the civil society provided input for this conduct of the training based on their areas of expertise. So many actually things that we have done together. I mean, the work program itself right now is in the second phase, and the APG has been involved from the first phase of that work program since 2010, 2015, and now 2016, 2020. And they have contributed many of the priority areas. In fact, they got together, I think, among themselves and see how they can contribute to the priority areas under the work program. So I would say that there are many entities that we have provided, and there are many things that the civil society can do, and I think we have already seen that. It's not only in terms of theories. I mean, they have been actually involved, and right now we want to see more of that, not only to the current members of the APG. We want to have, for example, more of the ASEAN-born NGOs supporting and working together with us in realizing One ASEAN One Response. In the regional contingency planning for One ASEAN One Response, the development of ASEAN Joint Disaster Response Plan, we have invited actually the APG as well as the civil society to take part and contribute. I know that some of the ASEAN-born civil society, we still need to develop their capacity, but there are those who have actually reached certain capacity, like Mercy Malaysia, where they have actually already earmarked some assets or some capabilities that can contribute to One ASEAN One Response. Over to you, Jeremy.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Adelina. And certainly there was discussion earlier in the call today as well about NGO participation in the APG and engagement with AHA Centre, and also questions around capacity building. So I think certainly there'll be interest to follow up from participants on this call and others in the future on this topic as well. A really interesting question actually has come in now about the new way of working, which is really an idea about bringing together more development and humanitarian work streams. And is the AHA Centre engaging in this type of thinking and through member states or through working with the UN or otherwise? Is there any engagement from the AHA Centre on new ways of working and possibly ways that NGOs could participate in some of this work? Over.
Thank you for that. Well, for now we have two things that guide us for the next 5 to 10 years. One is the One ASEAN One Response Declaration. It's already set the path for us, what to do, basically, in terms of getting the resources together to increase the speed, the scale, and solidarity of ASEAN responding to disaster as one. I think that's I would say that that's the new way of doing things. We cannot do it just by ourselves. We have to get others to do it. It's not so much about ASEAN anymore, but it's about reducing the disaster losses and identifying what actually we can contribute to the pool in a more coordinated manner. The other one is the Vision 2025 on disaster management that was already endorsed in December 2015, and that basically set the vision for ASEAN to become the global leader on disaster management. Actually, this vision came from the realization that there have been so many things that we have learned over the past 10 years. We have been the host of world-class disasters. We have been responding to disasters all the time. So we have the knowledge, and there's no better teacher than our own experience. And we want to accumulate that knowledge and share it with the others. And it is actually the fact that other regional organizations have come to us, have come to visit AHA Center to learn on how we have done it. It's not yet, well, I wouldn't say that it's a success story yet. I mean, the story is still unfolding, right? We can still see many things coming out of this. But there are already a few good things that we can share already with other regional organizations, and that I think that's the path for us to become the future global leader on disaster management. And that I would like to highlight is the fact that the risks are changing. The disasters of today and the disasters of today are not the same as the disaster of tomorrow. So AHA Center has to adapt to this, as well as our partners, including the civil society. Another thing that I need to highlight is that ASEAN countries are more capacitated. I mean, we have to, if we keep receiving and not giving, then it means that we have never learned our lessons. And it is time actually for us to really take the lead and for others to support. Therefore, last year in the Wellington Summit, the ASEAN ministers issued a joint statement that basically says that that we should be as locally as possible, and in terms of action, it should be nationally led, with regional organizations backing up the national effort, and international support as and when necessary. So with this increasing capacity of the countries, not only the government, but the countries and the communities within that country, I think we need to also adapt ourselves as the humanitarian actors. And that includes also the regional organizations. So in the future, I think the role of regional organization may be more and more in terms of knowledge, in terms of capacity enhancement, in terms of being the network coordinator for centers of excellence, in terms of innovation, and basically helping the ASEAN collectively to become the future global leader. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you very much. Now, we're just coming up on the end of time for the call, so I might even follow on from that question and put it back to Oliver and Dr. Heng if they want to have any final comments on a summary or a thought on the discussion, and possibly a thought about what new ways of working might be ahead for NGOs, the AHA Center and ASEAN and the UN in the coming years ahead. So maybe starting, Oliver, with yourself, and then Dr. Heng, and then back to Adelina for any wrap-up, and we'll close. Over to you, Oliver.
Well, thanks very much, Jeremy. I mean, the one thing I would commend to everybody is to keep an eye on what Antonio Gutierrez, the new Secretary General of the United Nations, is saying. He issued a report at the end of June, which basically laid out his vision for how he wants to reform the organization, I think fairly rapidly over the next 2 or 3 years. And at the center of that is this whole issue of kind of the new way of working, that we stop looking at things in these nice little silos and boxes that we have. OCHA is very much focused on humanitarian, and the UN Development Program is focused very much on development, and ASEAN, the AHA Centre, is very much focused on disaster management. We need to kind of stop looking at things through these lenses and see if we can find a way to be a little bit more holistic. The World Humanitarian Summit also called very strongly for this, and I think this is where Gutierrez sort of to a certain extent picked it up. But it's the other side of, it's another way of looking at this whole ridiculous humanitarian development divide that we have invented to make our lives simpler, which actually makes the lives of the people we're trying to help a lot more complicated. So I think there's a big piece of thinking for all of us to do, and I know that ASEAN has been prompted to think certainly this year around its engagement in non-natural disasters. There's been some interesting developments there, and I think for the UN we are being prompted by our member states to think very differently about what a useful United Nations looks like in 2017 and 2030 and 2050. And it's certainly not the dinosaur that we have right now of a large number of mandate-bound agencies supported by a secretariat and a Security Council that doesn't function very well. So I think the whole, the new way of working is looking at development, humanitarian, human rights all joined up, but I think it goes much further than that. It's about looking at kind of global governance and the role that the interrelationship between the UN, ASEAN, other regional organizations, civil society, and so on and so forth, and seeing how that pans out. So I think I don't have anything terribly specific on it right now because the proposals from the Secretary General will only come out in firm form at the end of the year. But what I would say is kind of watch this space, and certainly for my colleagues at ASEAN, and we've discussed this, so I'm not betraying any secrets. Certainly for my colleagues at ASEAN, we need to start thinking about what humanitarian / development / human rights action looks like in this region come 2025, come 2030, in a much more open and less siloed way than we have been doing up until now. Thank you.
Thanks, Oliver. Dr. Heng, any final comments from you on future working and new ways of working in the region?
Thank you. Yes, I accept what Oliver has said. I think NGOs are very lucky in the ASEAN region. We have great relationship with the UN, especially OCHA, and also we have a very good working relationship with AHA Centre and the ASEAN Secretariat. It's been quite a while. It's a long journey. A lot of trust has been built, and I think we should be patient and keep moving. Miracles can't happen overnight. I think we're all aware of it. But the important thing is we are making the right steps every day, and slowly but surely we're getting there. And finally, I'm just looking at the next 10 years or something, and looking regionally as well. While I agree with Oliver, I think maybe ASEAN may have its own way of working, which again may be different. But let's see what happens in 10 years' time. It's a long time. See you folks. Bye.
Thanks, Dr. Heng. I like the idea. Is it a new way? Is it a different way? Maybe it's both. Adelina, over to you for a final comment, and then we'll wrap the call up. Please go ahead.
Not so much coming from me, but because this is a forum where we share our thoughts with the ICVA members, I would like to concur with what Dr. Han said. I think in terms of the opportunity of working together with the civil society in this region, I think, as Dr. Heng mentioned, there are a lot of entry points and opportunities, and I think the governments in ASEAN and also the ASEAN relevant bodies, including our center, very much welcome this other humanitarian actors and how they can actually contribute to our work. I think the level of openness is good. Right now, what actually we're currently trying to address is basically managing expectations for the ASEAN Center. Oliver mentioned about the expectation from the humanitarian community that ASEAN will not only focus on disaster management but also for other humanitarian crises. And one thing that and Oliver knows this quite well, that ASEAN Center, in terms of the scope and mandate, our scope and mandate is given by two agreements. There is the Agreement on Disaster Management Emergency Response and the Agreement on the Establishment of ASEAN Center. And ASEAN Center is one of the machineries in ASEAN. It's one of the ASEAN bodies. There are also other bodies that are dealing with issues like transnational crime, human rights, peace and reconciliation, and all the others. So while there are expectations to expand the scope and mandate of our center, I think this will have to be done in stages because just like everybody has a mandate. Everybody has a scope of work that has been given. At the same time, expectation is growing, the risks are changing. And resources also is another issue that we have to deal with. So I think this presents opportunities, but at the same time also present challenges for the ASEAN Center. That I guess with the level of openness from the ASEAN Center as well as the ASEAN governments to work together with the other humanitarian actors, perhaps what we need to do in terms of the new way of doing things are be more innovative. When Sarkozy happened, we were able to open up the humanitarian space. That was actually based on innovative ways of doing things. I think right now, in view of the issues presented in front of us, what needs to be done is basically try to see how we can be more innovative, understanding the situation, the challenges, and the context. For us, also trying to do this one step at a time and not basically trying to do everything at once. Otherwise, then it will be too many things to do, and we will not be good at doing one thing. So I'll stop at that, and I'll conclude my statements at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adelina, and a big thank you once again to all of our speakers, Dr. Heng, Oliver, and Adelina Kamal. I really appreciate the time, and I think it's fair to say from the ICVA membership perspective, we really appreciate the insight into the workings of not just the AHA Centre itself, but also those partners that have a long history of engagement, because there's so much wealth of knowledge and so much that we need to get better at understanding if we're going to really increase the engagement of civil society with ASEAN and in the region. So thank you very much to everyone for joining. Apologies for running a little bit over time, and we look forward to having you join the next ICVA Regional Learning webinar coming up in a few weeks. Over and out.